Mm. Okay, is there anyone who wasn't here last Sunday that needs the handout that I hand out? And it was a list of the apostles and matching names and okay, besides, if you don't mind, yeah. You need one also, that's right. I'll just give Deborah hers. There you go. Thank you. Okay, our last lesson was, of course, about the apostles, and that handout I think will go a long way to helping you just sort out some differences in names and the fact that it does not represent other people. Initially, there were just the 12, um, and it's just that some of them were known by other names, but they are indeed the same people. I think it was Galen who asked something about. Did you do your research, Galen? Oh, okay. Well, I did. um, good, good. Well, that's good. Here's the problem with trying to sort out when the apostles died, and we know that all of them except one were martyred. Okay. The difficulty is communication, obviously, at that time, and finding out these things taking place. And so it's not necessarily who was first, although we know that who was first. We do know that James was first because that's recorded in Acts, but Acts the second chapter. But we don't know about the other apostles because their martyrdom was not necessarily revealed in Scripture. So we have to find it out from some historical document. But there is a if you want to just go to this website, it'll give you a list of all the different apostles and how they died. Okay, it won't tell you exactly when because it's not exactly when is not always known. Okay, but just Google. It's on Google, and it's www.csmedia1.com, and it has a list of all the apostles, and also talks a little bit about who wrote what book of the which apostles wrote books of the Bible and things like that. So that will help you in just seeing how they were martyred. Some of them were thrown off of a wall. We know that some were thrust through by sword. Others were crucified. But the interesting part of it is those that were crucified, they didn't use nails to put them on the cross. Isn't that interesting? Eh? They didn't use nails. They just tied them on or had them placed on in some other way. So at least as best I can determine. So anyway, it's an interesting place to look and see where all the apostles how they met their demise or the martyr. So Jesus having selected his 12 apostles, they're going to be his personal ambassadors while he is still here on earth. Okay. Remember, the purpose of the apostles was to do what? What was the purpose of the apostles? Their one primary responsibility was to carry out Jesus's mission on earth. Okay? In other words, Jesus had an earthly mission that he had to complete. There's obviously one part of his mission that they could not help him with, and that was, of course, his crucifixion, to go to heaven, to go to crucified, to be the Savior. But he selected these 12 apostles, these 12 men, to help him carry out his mission while he was here on earth and to succeed him after his death. He knew that he was going to leave this earth. He needed men that he could depend upon and trust to carry out his mission once he was gone. And so Mark reveals that He brought them together, he taught them, and then he sent them to preach. And that's what their total mission was. And we talked about the qualifications that they had to have, and one of the primary um, qualifications is that all 12 of these men had to have been with Jesus from his baptism all the way to his resurrection, and they had to have seen him resurrected from the dead and then his ascension into heaven. And then the obvious question that somebody always brings up, well, but you had the Apostle Paul, but if you read Acts, the 9th and the 22nd chapter, it's clear that Paul was converted by Jesus himself, who appeared to him and told him what he needed to do. And so he did. He did, in fact, he was, in fact, one of the observers by direct divine intervention of the reappearance of Jesus, so to speak, and his ascension into heaven. And so that was he was the only one, of course, that was not with him at the baptism except by divine revelation. Okay, so now we come to the point where, and we realize that in the account in Mark of all of this taking place, remember that the Sermon on the Mount is not in Mark. Okay? It's in Matthew, and a condensed and a shorter version is in Luke. But in context, when you read the account in Mark of the selection of the 12 apostles, you realize that between verses 19 and 20 is where the Sermon on the Mount took place. It's just that Mark did not write about it. Okay? It wasn't that he necessarily wasn't there. It's just that he did not write about it. And remember, Mark's primary purpose in his writing was to do what? What was Mark's primary emphasis in his writing? To what? To reveal, okay? To reveal Jesus as the Son of God, as the Son of Man, okay? And as the God walking in the flesh, where John, of course, emphasized the deity of Jesus. And so the account of the Sermon on the Mount is longer version is written in Matthew, the 5th through the 7th chapters, and then in Luke, the 6th chapter, there are some verses dedicated to it in a much more condensed version. And we're going to talk about the debate that took place, about, well, is this really the same discourse that's being talked about in the two versions? Because one is so much shorter. Not all of the verses that are in Matthew are in Luke, at least in the discourse that's written as it's written, but there are easy explanations for that to settle any dispute. But our text then would be Matthew, the 5th chapter, verses 1 through 12, and Luke, the 6th chapter, verses 17 through 26. Ed, would you please read, since I know you have a strong voice, Matthew, the 5th chapter, verses 1 through 12. And then John Brazil, would you read, after Ed is finished, Luke 6, 17 through 26? Okay? First, Matthew 5, 1 through 12. Thank you. Now, Luke, the 6th chapter, verses 17 through 26. Give him just a second to turn there, John. Luke 6, 17 through 26. Okay, John. Thank you. Because Matthew is more detailed, that'll be our base text for especially the Beatitudes especially, but the Sermon on the Mount in its totality. And you notice by reading Luke, of course, that there are some similarities to the Matthew's account, but Luke puts in there 4 woes, speaking directly to specific classes or status of people that he puts some admonishment and some warning to them that we will also discuss as we look at this. But it's the fact that Luke is so short and so brief in his description of basically only of about 4 of those that at least that people can see directly related, that causes people to question, has caused people to question in the past whether or not Luke is talking about the same discourse of Jesus as Matthew was. But all of that debate and all of those questions can be can be reconciled very easily if people just remember about the differences in the emphasis of the writers of the gospel accounts. Luke's emphasis was different than Matthew's. Okay? Matthew was more detailed because he wanted to be, or he needed to be, or he desired to be much more detailed. Because Luke's emphasis was a little bit different, that we'll talk about a little bit later, he found it okay, at least in these few verses, to be more brief. Although we're going to see, if people would just look, that what they think are omissions from Luke's account is actually, yeah, somebody's got to stand up and move around back there, right? Is actually Luke put it in other parts of his writing, but people fail to recognize that, and that's one of the fallacies of their debate. But let's talk first about where the location, because that has also been debated. And I don't want to spend too much time on it. Except that I think it's important that we know that there has been some debate about where the Sermon on the Mount took place. Now, all scholars agree that it was in the Galilean region. No question about that. And it took place likely in the first year of Jesus' Galilean ministry. There's not much debate about that. The debate involves the fact that there are 2 places in the Galilean region where it could have taken place. Before I get into that, though, it just seems to me sometimes that people get so wrapped up in the debates of trying to determine the exact location of things that they miss the whole point. But I do want us to be knowledgeable because we may be in a discussion with one of our denomination friends that wants to discuss that issue. There are scholars who believe that this took place at an area in the southwest to the west of the Sea of Galilee, in a region that they call the Jezreel Valley. In that region, there is they call them mountains in those days. They're really hills to us when we think about the difference between, $1,000 elevation versus 16,000. But there's two places where the elevation is about 1,000 feet in that Jezreel Valley. One of those places is called, and I think this was brought out in your reading, the Horns of Hayton. What is unique about this particular area is that while it is on a range of hills that is about 1,000 feet above the elevation of the village, and here we're probably talking about close to Capernaum, okay, is that there are two twin peaks that rise about 60 more feet above that range. Okay? Between those two peaks is a valley, as it was, or a defilade position, put it in military terms, where it's a flat area, and it's pretty substantial between the two peaks, where it's grassy. It's a grassy area, flat, where it could be that large crowds could gather. And the thing about it is, and the reason that a lot of scholars think that this is the more likely site, is because that defilade position, or that position between the two peaks, forms kind of an amphitheater because of just the topography that is in that area. And so they surmise that Jesus stood on the side of one of those peaks, a little bit above this lower area, to speak when he delivered the Sermon on the Mount. Leo Bowles, who is an old-time, long-time gospel minister in the Churches of Christ, believed that it was on Mount Tabor, going toward Tiberias, that it took place in that area. Now, do you remember what is significant about Mount Tabor? What took place there? What likely took, at least tradition tells us it took place, has to do with Jesus' transfiguration, okay? But if you look at the area of this Mount Tabor is more of a knoll than it is a peak, or if it has any other area around it. And it is true that the area below that, of course, is a high plateau area. So it is possible that large crowds could have gathered up to the foot of that particular mountain, and Jesus could have stood on the side of the mountain and spoke to the large crowds that were there. Because remember, Jesus is moving his ministry away from the synagogues out to the open air settings. And what was the two reasons that he wanted to move away from the synagogues areas? To escape or to get away from the Pharisaical opposition, because it was hindering his ability to carry out his ministry. And second, what did Luke's account reveal? People are still coming to him for healing, okay, and other maladies that they want healed. So he's still, and however, it also reveals that they were still coming to listen to him. Jesus' reputation is growing, and he has things that people want to hear. So he has these large multitudes, just these great throngs of people that are coming to hear him that press up against him and make it very uncomfortable at the very least for him. But he gets to a position so that he can, at least the crowd can be contained, so to speak, and he can speak more directly without having to worry about people pressing around him. So keep that in mind also. Now, what was the purpose of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount? What was the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount? Who is Jesus primarily speaking to? His disciples. Okay? His disciples. He's primarily speaking to his disciples. In fact, it isn't until the end of Matthew's account, chapter 7, verses 28 and 29, that he makes a point of reminding everybody that there were crowds listening also. But if you read, and if you read very carefully the Sermon on the Mount, you realize that Jesus over and over and over again is speaking directly to his disciples. He is equipping them, this first part especially, he's equipping them with the information they need to be able, remember, he's preparing them to carry out his ministry. It's very important to Jesus that they be equipped with the information that they need to carry out that ministry satisfactorily. And so Jesus begins his discourse by teaching them first about the qualities that are necessary for a person to be his disciple. He wants to make it very clear to them what the expectations are of them if they're going to be his ambassador. Remember, ambassadors represent some higher authority. And it's very important to Jesus that they represent him properly. And so he is beginning his discourse and his instruction on their being able to be his ambassador in a very specific way in a proper way. No debate about the timing of it. But where the next debate comes in then is whether or not, because of the differences in the two accounts, was this the same? Are they writing about the same discourse, or are they talking about, is Luke talking about a different occasion or a different discourse of Jesus than Matthew was? If you look at the similarities, at least at the beginning of the two accounts, you realize that there are striking similarities in what Luke writes about regarding what Matthew wrote about. But then Luke kind of shifts gears a little bit, and he adds into it some warnings to different classes of people, different groups of people, that Matthew doesn't. Unless you continue reading throughout the Sermon on the Mount and you realize that Jesus also talked about those things in Matthew's account, it's just that it's in a different form. Now, the debaters will say, well, there are about 44 verses in Matthew's account that aren't in Luke's. And there's about 4.5 verses in Luke's that are absent from Matthew's. What these proponents of on this particular side of the debate would fail to recognize is that if you read the entire Gospel of Luke, you come to realize that 34 of those so-called missing 44 verses are in Luke. It's just that they are in a different form. Or he may have said the same thing, but because he presented them sometimes in different situations and different circumstances, people grab a hold of that and they say, well, then, Luke wasn't talking about the same discourse. For instance, someone read Matthew 5:18, please. Read Matthew 5:18. Okay, now that's in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's account, right? Now turn over to Luke 16, and someone read verse 17 of Luke 16. Luke 16:17. Now, was Luke's words exactly the same as Matthew's? No. Was Luke's writing of that particular teaching, and that's, if you have a red letter edition, that's Jesus speaking in Luke's account also. Excuse me. But even if you don't, you know that Jesus is teaching there. He says it in a slightly different way and in a different situation. What situation is going on right now in Luke the 16th chapter, wherein Jesus is speaking about these things? What is accounted for in Luke 16? How does it begin? With what? There was a rich man who had a manager. So the unrighteous steward, right? And then as he continues on, okay, and then it says, and then now the Pharisees who were lovers, verse 14, of money were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him. So what does Luke do? Well, or what does Jesus do? He speaks to them. Okay? He speaks to them. So Luke's account of Jesus saying about the law is the same as Matthew's, just in a different circumstance and in a different situation. But the teaching is still there. Okay? So that's just an example. So what that tells us is that just because Luke didn't put his in the same order as Matthew did, or in the same, in the same grouping, does not mean they're not talking about the same discourse of Jesus. Now, because Luke said that Jesus stood on a plain, okay, his account is sometimes referred to as the Sermon on the Plain. Okay? Whether you call it the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, most scholars are in agreement that the discourse is the same. Both men are talking about the same, or writing about the same discourse of Jesus. Also, keep in mind that even Matthew's is not a lengthy account of what Jesus could have said and probably did say in that Sermon on the Mount. Jesus was known to teach for long periods of time at the same time. Well, if you read the Sermon on the Mount, you can read that in about, 5 or 6 minutes maybe, a good reader. Slow read, maybe 10 minutes. Well, it makes sense that Jesus would not have just sat down there and talked for only 10 minutes. Okay? So, the logical conclusion to come to is that both Matthew and Luke summarized or condensed what Jesus said, picking out the important points that they saw were necessary because of the audience they were writing to and what their emphasis was. So the so-called discrepancies are easily recognized in the fact that they're easily reconciled, by the fact that when you look at the emphasis of Matthew, his emphasis was on spiritual conditions, spiritual conditions. In fact, those Beatitudes, we'll start here in just a second, in just a few minutes, begin with how one develops spiritually in order to be a disciple of God. Whereas Luke's emphasis was on social differences. Why did he say it the way he said it regarding woe to the rich? Woe to you who are full. Because his emphasis was on social differences, not necessarily the spiritual situation of the people that he was writing to. And why would that be? What's Luke's background? He is a physician who's very, very much aware and very astute at determining, and we've seen this at other places in Luke's gospel that we read, about the social situation that everybody was having to deal with. He was especially concerned about the poor, physically poor, okay, of the time, and so that would be why he might emphasize being poor in a slightly different way than Matthew would, because Matthew was talking specifically about being poor spiritually. Luke probably was speaking about being poor spiritually, but more importantly, he was probably also talking about being physically poor, okay? Health-wise, economic-wise, socially, or whatever the case may be, okay? Any questions on those introductory comments? Yes, Brian. Mm-hmm. Right. Ed? Right. In John's account, right. Exactly. Exactly. And it doesn't make any sense that this would have been all that Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount. But thank goodness we have more than one account so that they either embellish each other or they'll add something a little bit different to give us more of a complete picture. Okay? Okay, any more questions? Well, we got about 4 minutes. We can get into the start of the Beatitudes, and then we'll finish up on Wednesday night. Let me say just a few things about to introduce us to the Beatitudes. I hope all of us recognize the word Beatitude is not in the English Bible. Okay, where the publishers get this coining of these first few verses of Matthew's account is from the Latin version of the Bible. In the Latin version of the Bible, verses 3 through 11 begin with the word blessed. That comes from a Latin word, and Irene reminded me from her Catholic background that she knew the word, beati or beatus. Okay, I think beatus is in our book that we read. Those words in Latin mean happy or blessed. Okay, and sometimes have a connotation of both. And so if you take the word happy and put it there for the word blessed, you would not be incorrect. Okay? And so then from that, we get the notion that what Jesus is talking about is how to be happy in the kingdom. How his disciples can be happy as they confront the myriad of obstacles and the myriad of difficulties. He's already warned them about the difficulties they were going to face, and he himself is experiencing a great deal of difficulty. from just the Pharisees alone. But this is the way that you can develop spiritually, not only to be an acceptable disciple of Christ, but a way to be happy also as you do it. And so when you read the Beatitudes, recognize that these blessings that Jesus says will result from a certain attitude, or a certain characteristic is a better word to think about. Okay? These are characteristics that Jesus expects from his disciples. And while he was delivering them, specifically his disciples there, no doubt there were lots of other folks who heard it because the crowds were still there. And it's written for us. So therefore, Jesus' instruction is to us also of what an acceptable, what a good disciple of Christ, what their character should be. And that's what we should garner the most from this. Now, the Beatitudes are in two groups. The first group of 4, verses 3 through 6, deal with personal qualities. And the second group, verses 7 through 12, talk about more interpersonal relationships. In other words, how you treat others, how you deal with others. And so as we go through this, as we go through these Beatitudes, make sure that you remember the difference between the two that Jesus is talking about. First, he's going to tell you what your character needs to be, and then he talks about some practical application. Having built that good character, this is the way you're going to deal with other people with that good character. And everybody knows there's two words. There is reputation and there's character. Reputation, hopefully, always matches with your character. But remember, reputation is how other people see you. Right? Reputation is how others think of you. Character is what you are internally. That's your foundation. That's your fundamentals. That's what makes you who you are. That's your character. And what Jesus is talking about here is, first, let's build our character, make it a strong character, and then use that character to properly deal with other people. That's really what the Beatitudes are all about. Okay? Okay. Any questions? Any comments? Okay. So we're out of time. But Wednesday night we'll go through, there's just 8 of them, so it won't take us a long time to go through them, and then we'll answer the questions. And I understand from one comment that there's some possibility that some of the questions that are asked about this particular group in the book they're having difficulty finding the answers. And so if you have trouble with some of the answers, don't worry about it, okay? When we come together on Wednesday, we'll make sure that everybody understands, and if the question is not a good question, we don't have to worry about it. Remember, the purpose is not to answer every question in black and white, but just simply to understand the fundamentals and the important parts of that particular part. And so we will deal with the Beatitudes, Matthew 5, 3 through 12, and Luke 6, 20 through 26 on Wednesday night. Thank you very much.